Women are models of true discipleship. Jesus praises them. Women are left vulnerable in religious and social institutions. Jesus laments with them. Two of the readings we hear from today both include widows, women who are left vulnerable by their social and religious institution. In the first reading, we hear of this woman who's trying to survive a famine. She encounters Elijah the prophet, and Elijah's asking a lot from her. Please bring me water and bread. All she can respond to him is, I have nothing to bake. I do not have what you desire. And Elijah says, do not be afraid. Her response was one of faith, to go and trust that God will provide for her and her son. In our gospel today, we see Jesus gather the disciples and say, hey, do you see that woman over there? She has contributed more than anyone else, even though she contributed a few cents. But what she contributes comes from her poverty, not her abundance. True discipleship. The actions of this woman and Jesus recognizing her reflects the call of Jesus for each of us to give of ourselves freely and to live and offer ourselves in our own poverty. She models this for us. I have to be transparent. What you're hearing today is not my original homily. You see, I spent a few weeks working with these readings, and I knew from the beginning that I wanted to use these women to talk about the role of women in the church, and I wanted to talk about how the structure of our church and our society today still leave women vulnerable and on the margins. I wanted to empower this church community to see these women as models of discipleship, powerful, faithful people who call us to give of ourselves generously. In a way, I felt pressure to give this kind of homily. Our church is indeed broken. Our country is broken. These women provide us a space to lament in the social and religious structures that leave us vulnerable, while also reminding us that it is in our tradition and our sacred text that women lead the way for a life of faith and discipleship. How can I not preach about that? I had a really good homily, actually. It's powerful. But of course, the Spirit works in mysterious and funny ways. A few days ago, while I was editing, now this so-called really good homily, I became aware of this soft invitation to go deeper. It was an invitation that I can now recognize was there from the beginning of my process of creating this homily. These were the questions that began to stir in me. How was I being like the Pharisees and scribes in preparing my homily? How was I being like the wealthy people, only contributing from my surplus, from my abundance? Now here's a tough one. This one was the one that slowed me down. How was I more focused on my external success in breaking open the Word, rather than allowing these texts, these readings, these women to work in and through me? I stopped immediately, and I began to pray with these readings instead of using them. Please do not get me wrong, church. These readings certainly call us to lament and to confront the challenges and graces of discipleship. These women certainly model for us how to be in this broken world and to offer ourselves generously. However, in my attempts to bring my own anger, my own lamentations of the brokenness of the church in our country today, and my desire for the voices of women to be lifted, I became much like the Pharisees and scribes. I was more focused on how I would be received and who I would impact in breaking open the Word today than being aware of how my heart was responding to these readings. I must be a strong woman preaching. I must show people I have a theology degree. I need to show from the pupil that I am angry and my voice demands to be heard. I was driven by these narratives and titles. Once I began to pray with these readings, I was drawn to look inward and challenge how I may be contributing from my surplus, not from my poverty. My invitation for you to come to this table today is centered on looking inward. We must change what must change in my life, in our life, and in our hearts, so that I may offer myself more generously from my own poverty to the work of God in this world. So now that I told you about this awesome homily that I'm not going to share with you today, let me share with you a story that hopefully brings all this together. Women, my good but not in the right spirit homily, inward focus, and an offering of self from my own poverty. I'm a new high school teacher. I started teaching last year in religious studies at a Catholic school in the Bay Area. And my prior experience was in campus ministry, so this was very new for me. I work really hard to create lesson plans that help students connect with the Bible, that can create space for students to wrestle with their own faith and ask questions about God. I had a hard time learning how to do this well. I'm still learning. I remember there was this one lesson that I spent hours preparing. I was exegeting a text from the Hebrew scriptures, and I crushed it. I pulled in cultural references. I pulled in their own experience from high school. I had images, videos, board work, group work. I was on it. And they were with me. They were engaged the whole time. I made them laugh. I also made them pause. And most importantly, I gave them space to ask questions about the text and gave them tools to discern their own interpretation. In the moment, I felt alive. To be creating that space with my little sophomores felt really good. Afterwards, when the bell rang, the students were very energetic and were saying, "Thank you, Miss Miguens. Thank you, Miss Miguens." It was awesome. And then I had a student linger. I'm picking up my things and I say, "What's up?" And the student says, "Miss Miguens, I just wanted to say thank you." And immediately, of course, my ego is like, "Oh yeah, I know. It was an awesome lesson. Feels really good." And this is what the student said to me. "Miss Miguens, I wanted to say thank you because at the beginning of class, you said, 'Hey, how are you doing?' And you were the only person throughout this whole day that asked me in a way that made me feel like you actually wanted to know. And I felt safe enough to tell you how I actually was feeling. And I wanted to say thank you. I wanted to say thank you for that. It means a lot to me." You know, at the time, I was like, absolutely, no problem. I always want to know about my students. I want to know how they're doing. And the student leaves. My immediate thought, of course, after the student leaves, was a very Pharisee and scribe thing to do in me. I said, "Hey, how are you? Is that what you got from my lesson? I had an awesome lesson. That's what you got." So I had to find a way to pray with it later on. And of course, I found in my prayer that this student was grace for me that day. This student was a reminder of what I am called to offer those I minister. I offer my gifts, myself from my place of poverty. Let me try to explain this. My lesson and work in the classroom is rooted in my desire for students to connect with Scripture and God, so in of itself is good. However, sometimes I am more focused on how awesome my lesson plan is going to be, or I'm too worried about how my students will like it or be engaged with it, that I give myself only to that. Pharisee, scribe-like. Sometimes it's easier for me to produce a good lesson than it is for me to take the time to say, "How are you?" and mean it. Time, in a certain sense, is my poverty. especially when I'm at school. I'm pulled in too many directions. I'm always on the move. But when I stopped, I paused, I looked at this student and I said, "Hey, how are you?" I offered myself in a way that was worth a lot more than the hours of lesson planning. Please know that I'm well aware that lesson planning takes time. I love to do it. I will do it well. I'm a responsible educator. However, I am also responsible in giving of myself, much like the woman in the temple in the Gospels today. Sometimes what I give in smaller moments, what I give in the busiest of time, is the most I can give students. That lesson plan was awesome. My presence and care for students is a deeper invitation and calling forth of an offering of self. That student was a gift in reminding me that the external, though important, cannot take priority of the internal work, which at times might seem smaller or simpler. Today, the readings invite us to be present to what is happening internally. Much like the models of the women in these readings, how are we preparing our hearts to not only give generously, but to give even from our own poverty? How are we allowing our titles, honor, ego, and our reputation to get in the way of being present to others? What needs to happen in our lives to be more attentive to the widows of the world, those who can show us the path towards true discipleship? We cannot dismantle structures if we are not in check with what needs to happen in us first. The women in these readings show us that there is a brokenness in our world that leave them vulnerable. And like them, we must have faith. We must be courageous to see this brokenness, and we must act generously from our own poverty, even if it begins by admitting that a homily that was written was not in the right spirit, or even if it begins with a simple, "Hey, how are you?"